When Claire Jensen signed the papers to inherit her late uncle's crumbling brick warehouse, everyone in town laughed. 3 months later, the same people were standing behind police barricades, watching as crates of uncut diamonds were carried out from beneath the floorboards she'd been mocked for sweeping. Before we dive into this story of heartbreak, redemption, and the kind of twist that could only be written by fate itself, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Rain was still clinging to the edges of the morning when Claire Jensen stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the law office, clutching an envelope that felt too heavy for what it contained. Her fingers were trembling, not from cold, but from the kind of exhaustion that doesn't sleep when you do. Inside was a single sheet of paper with her name written in looping black ink, a name that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Beneficiary. The word looked wrong beside it, like a joke she wasn't in on. The lawyer had been kind, in the way people are when they don't know how to say, "I'm sorry your life's still a mess." He'd offered her tea in a mug that tasted faintly of dust and paperwork, then cleared his throat. "Your uncle left you property," he said, eyes flicking over the rims of his glasses. "A warehouse on 5th and Holloway." Claire blinked. "A what?" "A warehouse," he repeated, sliding a faded photo across the desk. Brick, gray, unloved. Ivy crawling up the walls like veins. One of those buildings you pass every day and never really see. Her laugh came out sharp and tired. "I can't even afford my own storage unit." He gave a sympathetic shrug. "It's technically valuable property." He hesitated, as if the next part might break something fragile. "There are unpaid taxes, of course, and the city's filed minor code violations, but it's yours." Claire took the envelope, thanked him with practiced politeness, and walked out into the drizzle. The wind pushed against her like it knew the punchline already. A single mom of two, barely keeping the lights on, now the proud owner of an ancient warehouse that probably smelled like mold and regret. She almost laughed. Almost. By the time she picked up Ethan and Lily from school, the clouds had settled low and heavy. Ethan asked if they could stop for ice cream. "Next week," she said. He didn't argue, just nodded the way 8-year-olds do when they've already learned what disappointment sounds like. They drove past strip malls and forgotten train yards until the city gave way to rust. The warehouse waited there, massive, still, like something time had tried to erase but couldn't quite finish. Its red bricks were now closer to brown, chipped and weathered. The front doors, steel and scarred, bore the faint outline of a name long painted over. R. Jensen Imports. Claire parked and sat behind the wheel for a full minute, the engine ticking in protest. Lily peered through the window. "Is this our new house?" Claire smiled, soft and sad. "Not exactly, sweetheart." When she stepped out, the air smelled of rain and rust. The gravel crunched under her shoes as she approached the entrance. A single padlock hung from the latch, rusted but unbroken. She reached into the envelope again and found a key taped to the letter inside, its tag yellowed and handwritten, "South Door." The key turned with a groan, and the door opened into darkness. The first breath she took tasted like old wood and stories no one finished telling. Dust drifted through the light spilling from the hallway window, catching motes that shimmered like ghosts. The floor creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. She expected emptiness, but instead found echoes. An old piano pushed against the wall, silent but proud. Crates marked with destinations she'd never heard of. A calendar from 1981 still hanging crookedly near the office door. The air hummed faintly, as if the building itself was remembering. "Mom?" Lily's small voice echoed behind her. "It's cold." Claire nodded and turned. "We won't stay long." But she didn't leave right away. She stood in the middle of the room, eyes sweeping across the space, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was drowning. The warehouse was rough and tired and unwanted, just like her. But there was something about the way the light fell through the cracked windows, golden and fragile, that made her think maybe it wasn't broken. Maybe it was waiting. Ethan tugged on her sleeve. "Why would Uncle Robert leave this to you?" She didn't know. She'd barely known the man, just vague childhood memories of him sitting on the porch at her mother's house, always humming some tune she couldn't place. But now, standing in the hollow of his forgotten empire, she felt a pulse under the dust, a kind of presence. She looked at her children, then at the building, then at her reflection in a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. For years she'd promised them that things would get better. But maybe better wasn't the point. Maybe different was enough. Outside, the rain stopped. A single ray of sunlight slipped through the high windows, landing on a spot near the far wall, a patch of floor that looked newer than the rest. She didn't notice it then. She just breathed in, slow and steady, and whispered to herself, "All right. Let's see what you've got for us." And, for the first time in a very long while, the silence answered back. By sunrise, the story had already made its rounds. In a small town like Marrow Creek, gossip traveled faster than any headline, carried on the hiss of espresso machines and whispered across breakfast counters. At Dale's Diner, where conversations tasted like syrup and small-town certainty, Claire Jensen's name had become the morning special. "Did you hear?" someone asked between bites of toast. "Claire Jensen inherited that dump by the river." The woman beside him laughed, the sound brittle as cracked glass. "Figures. She could turn gold into debt if you gave her a chance." Even the cook, half listening from behind the grill, smirked and said, "Guess some people attract rust." It rippled through the room like second-hand smoke, mockery disguised as community. By the time Claire drove past the diner on her way to drop the kids at school, she could almost feel the laughter pressing against the windows. She didn't look in. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago. When people decide what you are, no explanation changes their minds. Lily sat in the back seat, humming to herself, sketchbook open on her knees. Ethan stared out the window, silent, chewing on the sleeve of his hoodie. "You're quiet today," she said, glancing at him in the mirror. He shrugged. "Kid said you bought a haunted building." She smiled faintly. "Oh? Did they also say it grants wishes?" "No, just rats." Claire laughed softly. "Then maybe the rats are the ones granting wishes." Ethan rolled his eyes, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He was 8 going on 40, carrying too much of her worry in his small shoulders. When they reached the curb outside the school, she squeezed his hand before he climbed out. "Hey," she said, "don't believe everything people say." He looked up at her, eyes too wise for his age. "Do you?" The question stayed with her long after the door shut. By mid-morning, she was parked outside the warehouse again, her dented Corolla looking like a lost toy in the empty lot. The air smelled of dust and damp brick. She stood there for a while, keys in hand, feeling the weight of other people's laughter. It wasn't new, just louder this time. The building loomed in front of her, massive and indifferent. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Up close, it felt patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to stop seeing it as a ruin. Ivy curled up its sides like green scars. Sunlight broke across the surface, finding beauty in what time had forgotten. Claire walked to the front door and found the mail slot half open, a small key tucked inside an envelope marked in faded ink, "South Door." The handwriting was old-fashioned, the kind that came from someone who wrote letters, not emails. She turned it over in her palm. "You left me homework, didn't you, Uncle Robert?" she murmured. The side path to the south entrance was uneven, lined with wild grass and broken glass that glittered faintly in the sun. When she reached the door, she slipped the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then gave way with a low, aching groan, like an old man stretching after years of silence. The door opened to a rush of cold air, musty and sweet, the scent of rain trapped in wood and stone. Light spilled in through the crack, catching swirls of dust that drifted like smoke. Claire stepped inside, her footsteps echoing across the hollow space. Somewhere deep within, water dripped steadily, the sound rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The place was quiet but not empty. There was presence in the air, something unseen but watching, listening. Claire traced her fingers along the rough brick wall, feeling the pulse of age beneath her skin. She imagined her uncle walking through here years ago, maybe humming to himself, maybe hiding something he never wanted found. Her reflection flickered in a broken window, faint, fractured, but there. A woman who had been laughed at so many times she almost believed she was the joke. Yet, standing there, in that cavern of silence and sunlight, she felt a strange flicker in her chest. Not pride, not hope. Just a quiet defiance that whispered, "Maybe they're wrong about me." She walked deeper, her boots crunching on debris, eyes adjusting to the dim light. There were crates stacked against the far wall, a desk covered in yellowed papers, and a single chair tipped on its side. The air felt thick, full of stories sealed in dust. Claire exhaled slowly. "All right," she whispered to the room, voice steady, deliberate. "Let's see what's been waiting." And as her words echoed through the rafters, something shifted. A faint vibration, a sigh from the earth itself, as though the warehouse had finally heard her and was answering back after all these years. The sound of a truck engine broke the quiet that had settled over the warehouse that afternoon. Claire looked up from the corner she'd been sweeping, more dust than progress, and watched as an old blue pickup rolled to a stop beside her car. The driver climbed out slowly, his movements deliberate, like a man who didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. He wore a denim jacket that had seen years of labor, sleeves faded to the color of old sky. When he closed the door, the keys jingled on a hook clipped to his belt, and the way he stood there, solid, patient, made him look more like a part of the building than a visitor to it. "You Jensen's niece?" he asked, voice low but steady. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans and nodded. "That's me." "And you are?" "Eli Ward," he said. "Did maintenance for your uncle back in the day. Heard you were poking around. Thought you might need a hand before this place eats you alive." Claire half smiled, unsure if it was a joke. "Depends on your rates. The last thing I need is another bill I can't pay." Eli gave a small shrug and stepped past her, looking at the cracked concrete like it was a map. "You can't afford not to fix the wiring. Half this place could go up in sparks." He crouched, ran a finger over a hairline fracture, and tapped the ground twice. "He wasn't crazy, you know." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Your uncle," he said. "People around here said he was losing it before he died. Whispered about treasure or smuggling or some secret buried in the walls. But the only thing I ever saw him hoard was regret." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Claire leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Sounds like most men who die alone," she said softly. Eli looked up then, really looked at her. His eyes were gray, not cold, but the kind of gray that had seen storms. "He wasn't alone," he said quietly. "He was haunted." Different thing entirely. Claire didn't know what to say to that. The sound of a loose metal sheet clanging in the wind filled the silence between them. She busied herself by checking the windows, pretending not to feel the weight of his gaze following her. When she turned back, Eli was near the far wall, tapping at the panels with the handle of his screwdriver, listening. "This section's hollow," he murmured. "Always wondered about that." "Probably rats," she said automatically. "Maybe," he replied, but there was something in the way his eyes lingered on that spot. A flicker of curiosity or memory, she couldn't tell. Then again, maybe not. Claire crossed her arms. "If you're fixing the wiring, I can pay half now, half later," she offered, her voice brisk, businesslike, the tone of someone who had learned to negotiate survival. He straightened up and smiled slightly. Not mocking, not kind, just knowing. "You're the kind who pays even when she doesn't have to, aren't you?" The question caught her off guard. It wasn't about money, and they both knew it. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her bag from the desk and said, "I'll be back in the morning. Try not to electrocute yourself." He chuckled low in his throat. "I'll do my best." When she left, the warehouse hummed with a strange new energy, as if her uncle's ghost had been waiting for someone else to enter the story. The air felt thicker, aware. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the numbers in her checkbook. The math never lied, but it never told the whole truth either. She thought of Eli's steady hands, the way his voice carried that quiet certainty of people who've buried too much and survived anyway. She didn't believe in hidden treasure, only unpaid invoices and lost sleep, but his words had rooted somewhere in her mind. He wasn't crazy. The next morning, she returned to the warehouse just as sunlight was slipping through the cracks in the roof. The place looked different, less abandoned, like it had been waiting for her. As she walked toward the back wall, something caught her eye. A section of paneling just slightly misaligned. When she pressed against it, it shifted. Behind it, folded neatly in a dust-covered frame, was a yellowing sheet of paper. A blueprint. The ink was faded, but she could still make out her uncle's handwriting in the corner. Vault access. Level B. Claire stood there for a long moment, pulse thudding in her throat. Maybe Eli was right. Maybe her uncle hadn't been crazy after all. Maybe he'd just been misunderstood, like her. She exhaled slowly, fingers trembling as she brushed the dust from the drawing. "What were you hiding, old man?" she whispered. The building stayed silent, but somewhere beneath her feet something answered, a faint metallic echo, like a secret exhaling after years of holding its breath. The morning light slipped through the high windows in thin, golden stripes, turning the dust in the air into quiet galaxies. Claire sat at the old wooden desk, the blueprint spread out carefully before her, anchored by a coffee mug and an old wrench she'd found on the floor. The paper trembled under her fingertips, fragile and browned with age, the edges curling like old bark. She'd found it tucked behind a false panel in the office wall, sealed away like a confession. At first, she'd thought it was just an old construction plan. Beams, piping, maybe old drainage lines. But when she'd leaned closer to read the small, faint letters scrawled at the bottom, her breath had caught in her throat. R. Jensen. Vault access level B. The warehouse didn't have a basement. No staircase, no hatch, no sign of one. She had checked the entire perimeter the night before, her flashlight beam sweeping across the concrete floor like a searching heartbeat. Still, the blueprint was precise. Clean lines, measurements, angles, and right there, between two support beams on the south end of the structure, a small square marked vault. She traced it with her fingertip again, her pulse keeping time with the distant drip of water somewhere deeper in the building. It made no sense. Her uncle had been a quiet man, a recluse even, known more for his odd silences than for any fortune. The town had called him Warehouse Robert, muttering about eccentricities and debt. Yet here, under her palm, was proof of something else, intentional, secret, deliberate. When Eli arrived later that morning, his truck rattling up the gravel drive, she was already waiting at the open door, blueprint in hand. He caught sight of her face before she spoke and frowned slightly. "You look like you just saw a ghost." "Close enough," she said, and handed him the paper. He spread it out on the hood of his truck, leaning close, squinting under the brim of his cap. For a long time, he didn't say a word. Then he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Your uncle wasn't just tinkering around here. These are professional plans." He tapped a calloused finger against the printed title. "Mining engineering. He worked with load-bearing structures. This is no hobby sketch." Claire folded her arms, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. "He was in mining?" Eli nodded. "Back in '73, I think, before he came back here. Worked contracts for a company overseas. Congo, maybe. My dad mentioned it once." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "You think he brought something back with him?" "I don't know what to think." He studied the blueprint again. "Vault access level B," he murmured. "So where's level A?" She shook her head. "This building has no lower level. I checked. Nothing." Eli crouched, examining the floor through the open doorway. "You sure?" "As sure as I can be without tearing it up." He stood, dusted his hands, and nodded toward the far wall. "Then maybe it's time we do." The two of them moved across the room to the southern end, following the grid lines on the blueprint. The air was cooler there, heavy with the smell of oil and old concrete. Eli knelt first, tapping along the ground with the handle of his hammer, listening. The first few hits gave back dull thuds, solid, but then, near the corner beneath an old shelving unit, the sound changed. Hollow. He tapped again. Hollow still. He looked up at her. "Here." Claire's throat tightened. Together they pried up the cracked flooring with a crowbar, chunks of concrete and dust scattering across the ground. Beneath it was something darker, smoother, metal, streaked with rust. Eli brushed the dirt away with his sleeve. It wasn't just any plate. It was circular, with a faint outline of an old industrial hatch. He ran his fingers along the edge until they found a seam, then looked at her. "It's welded shut." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Because someone didn't want it opened again." Claire crouched beside him, staring at the faint letters etched into the rim, almost invisible under years of grime. She leaned closer, squinting. R.J. Vault, her uncle's initials again. A shiver ran down her spine. She looked at Eli, her voice unsteady. "Do you think he really hid something here?" Eli didn't answer right away. He stood, brushing off his hands, his gaze still fixed on the hatch. "You ever wonder," he said slowly, "what your family never wanted you to know?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than dust, sharper than fear. Claire looked down at the metal circle glinting faintly under the lamplight and felt the truth press against her ribs. She had inherited more than a warehouse. She had inherited a secret that had been waiting decades to be found. And now that she had, there was no unknowing it. The air inside the warehouse began to change. It no longer smelled of neglect. It smelled of dust and discovery. Every day Claire came back with a new purpose, armed with gloves, trash bags, and an ache she didn't know had a name. Cleaning became ritual, and with every layer of grime she lifted, her uncle's ghost seemed to breathe a little louder through the walls. Stacks of yellowed invoices filled the office, crates, shipments, export forms that made no sense to her. Robert Jensen, it turned out, had kept everything. Receipts from the 70s, mining permits, even hand-drawn sketches of machinery whose names she couldn't pronounce. He'd written in a looping, deliberate hand, neat enough to be almost military, each entry precise, each margin filled with codes and scribbles that didn't look like they belonged to a man slipping into madness. After a week of sorting, she found the ledgers, 4 of them, thick, leather-bound, and sealed with rubber bands that snapped like brittle bones when she pulled them apart. The first page was dated 1978. Columns of numbers lined up with mechanical perfection, shipments, coordinates, initials. It took her a few pages to realize they weren't random. She sat at the desk under the flickering lamp, tracing her finger down the entries, whispering the numbers out loud. They were too consistent, too rhythmic. At first, she thought it was just bookkeeping, imports, maybe old trade records, but then she noticed the letters scrawled again and again in the margins. DRC. She frowned, opening her laptop. The search results came quickly. Democratic Republic of the Congo, mining operations, diamonds, conflict. Words like smuggling and sanctions bled across the screen in cold headlines. Claire leaned back, her chest tightening. "That's impossible," she murmured. Her uncle was a recluse, not a criminal. When Eli showed up later that afternoon, she handed him one of the ledgers, open to a random page. "Look at this," she said. He scanned the lines, brow furrowed. "These aren't shipping records," he said slowly. "They're extraction logs. mining output. Jensen worked under a contract overseas, engineering, construction. My old man mentioned it once, said the operation got shut down when the government started asking questions. Illegal exports? Something like that. He turned another page, the old paper whispering between his fingers. You think he smuggled them? Claire shook her head, though she wasn't sure. I think he was keeping track of something no one was supposed to. Eli flipped to the back of the ledger, where rows of figures ended the same way each time, 22 million. The ink was darker there, pressed hard, as if written by a shaking hand. That's a lot of zeros, he said. She nodded. Every entry ends with it. I've gone through 3 of the books. It's always the same. 22 million what? That's what scares me, she whispered. They sat in silence, the hum of the overhead lamp filling the room. Outside, a train passed in the distance, its whistle long and mournful. Eli finally closed the ledger and set it down gently. Whatever he was part of, it wasn't small. Claire rubbed her temples. He didn't even have a will until me. If he had money, why leave me this? Maybe it wasn't about money, Eli said. Maybe it was about guilt. That word lingered, guilt. It felt like a thread she didn't want to pull but couldn't stop touching. She looked around at the boxes stacked against the walls, at the careful order of her uncle's madness. He hadn't been hoarding junk. He'd been documenting something, preserving it, hiding it. When she flipped through the last ledger that night, alone, she noticed faint indentations on the final page, writing that had been erased. She angled it toward the light, and the words began to emerge in ghostly strokes. Not all debts are paid in cash. Her pulse kicked against her ribs. She closed the book, hands trembling, and leaned back in the chair. For the first time since inheriting the warehouse, she didn't feel like the owner. She felt like the next link in a chain her uncle had forged decades ago, one built out of secrets and numbers and something far heavier than money. She thought of the people in the diner, of their laughter and easy cruelty. She thought of how quickly people turned the unknown into ridicule, and now she wondered if her uncle had once felt that same sting, sitting right where she was, trying to keep the truth buried under ledgers and locks. Claire glanced down at the final figure again, 22 million, and traced the ink with her finger. Diamonds, blood, debt. The numbers meant something, and somehow she knew they weren't done with her yet. The week after Claire and Eli uncovered the ledgers, the warehouse began to feel heavier, like it was aware of its own secrets again. The air hummed differently, restless, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She'd tried to keep herself busy, cleaning, cataloging, anything to quiet the gnawing unease that had crept into her bones. The ledgers sat locked in a file cabinet in her living room now, their presence humming like static in the back of her mind. Every night she thought about them, about the initials DRC, about the number that haunted every page, 22 million. Every morning she promised herself she'd stop digging. Every afternoon she broke that promise. It was just after lunch when the black SUV rolled up. It didn't belong in this part of town. Too sleek, too silent. The kind of car that didn't stop without a reason. Claire was kneeling near the front door, sorting through a pile of rusted tools, when she caught the gleam of sunlight off the polished hood. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in a gray suit that looked like it had been pressed by confidence itself. He walked like he'd already been here before, like the place belonged to him. "Miss Jensen," he said, voice calm, low, and practiced. She straightened, brushing the dust from her hands. "That's right." He smiled, small, courteous, almost too careful. "I represent the Wardstone Group. We're interested in purchasing your warehouse." Claire blinked. "Wardstone Group?" He nodded. "Real estate development firm. We're acquiring older properties in the area. This one happens to fall within our zoning interest." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, sealed and crisp. "Our offer is $80,000. For a moment she couldn't breathe. $80,000. It was more than she'd ever had, more than she could even picture. Her mind flicked through every unpaid bill, every late notice, Every night she'd eaten canned soup and told her kids it was camping food. 80,000 could change everything. But then she looked at him again, his posture, his shoes too clean for gravel, the faint impatience in his smile. "Why?" she asked. "Why this building?" He blinked, just once, the kind of flicker that happens when a script is interrupted. "As I said, historical value. Old industrial structures like this are rare. We'd like to preserve its legacy." The words sounded too polished, too measured. Claire didn't buy them. "Historical value doesn't usually come with that many zeros," she said quietly. The man's smile held, but his eyes didn't. "Well," he said, "we're generous with what matters to us." From inside, Eli's voice broke the tension. "That's a lie," he muttered, stepping into the doorway with a rag in his hand. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. The man turned, the professional veneer cracking just enough to show the edge beneath. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Maintenance," Eli said flatly. "And you're wasting her time." Claire felt the man's gaze flick between them, reassessing. When he looked back at her, the smile had vanished entirely. "Ms. Jensen," he said, his voice softer now, quieter, but colder. "Sometimes things left buried should stay that way." The sentence cut through her like a draft. For a heartbeat she couldn't speak. Then she squared her shoulders. "I'm not selling." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, crisp and mechanical. "You might want to reconsider before a curiosity becomes dangerous." "Is that a threat?" she asked. He smiled again, and this time it reached nowhere near his eyes. "A suggestion." When he left, the SUV rolled away without sound, disappearing down the street like a shadow melting into daylight. Claire stood there long after the sound of its engine had faded, her pulse racing. Eli walked up beside her, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You did good," he said, "but we just painted a target on your back." That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak in her apartment made her flinch. Around midnight, she drove back to the warehouse, headlights carving thin paths through the fog. The air was colder than before, sharp against her skin. The building stood silent, watching. When she stepped inside, she knew instantly something was wrong. A window in the back office was shattered, glass glittering like ice across the floor. Her breath came short. She scanned the room. Nothing missing, no tools disturbed. Then she saw it. Across the desk, written in the dust with a finger, were 3 words, uneven and deliberate. "Leave it alone." She stood there trembling, the wind from the broken window brushing her hair like a warning. For the first time, she realized this wasn't about an old warehouse anymore. It was about something deeper, something buried, and someone who would do anything to keep it that way. The morning after the break-in, the warehouse felt different. Not dangerous exactly, more aware, like it had finally opened its eyes. Claire walked through the main hall, tracing her fingertips along the brick wall as she moved. Her uncle's old smell lingered faintly in the air. Sawdust, coffee, oil, and something metallic beneath it. Eli had promised to meet her after lunch, and she'd spent the morning doing what she always did when she was nervous, cleaning. She swept, sorted, rearranged, anything to keep her hands busy. But no matter how much dust she chased away, something about the space still hummed with unfinished stories. When Eli arrived, he didn't bother with small talk. He just nodded, grabbed his tool bag, and went straight to the southern end of the warehouse where the floor dipped slightly. "You hear that?" he asked, tapping his boot against the boards. Claire frowned. "Hear what?" He tapped again. The sound wasn't right, hollow, not solid. "That," he said. "You hear the echo?" "There's something under here." They pulled up the first few planks easily. The wood gave way without much fight, the nails surrendering after decades of neglect. Beneath the boards lay a layer of packed dust and grime, so thick that when Eli brushed it aside with his gloved hand, the air filled with ghostly clouds. And then they saw it, the dull gleam of metal. It was a slab, about 3 feet wide, the edges sealed with bolts and rust. Eli knelt down, running his fingers over the surface. "Steel," he muttered. "Industrial grade." He pressed his ear to it and knocked once, listening to the echo ripple below. There's space underneath. Claire crouched beside him, her throat tight. "A cellar?" He shook his head. "No cellars built like this." "This is something else." There was no handle, no latch, just a single keyhole near the corner. But it wasn't round, it was triangular, carved with precision. Claire stared at it, her mind racing. "That shape," she said softly, I've seen it before." "Where?" "In his things. Upstairs." They searched the office for over an hour, sifting through the remnants of her uncle's life, drawers full of broken pens, old maps, receipts, and a dozen small relics that meant nothing to anyone but him. Claire's fingers brushed against a wooden jewelry box half hidden behind a stack of faded blueprints. Inside were a few coins, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, and a brass pendant strung on a thin chain. She lifted it, holding it up to the light. The pendant was triangular, one edge engraved with the initials R.J. Her heart started to hammer. "Think that's our key?" Eli asked. Only one way to find out. They returned to the hatch, the pendant warm in her palm. Claire knelt and pressed the pointed edge into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. For a moment nothing happened. Then she twisted it. The mechanism clicked once, sharp and final, and the air in the room seemed to change. It wasn't dramatic, no rush of wind or a thunderclap, just a subtle shift. The kind that makes you realize something has been waiting for a long time to be found. Eli slid his hands under the edge of the hatch and lifted. It resisted, groaning in protest, before finally yielding with a slow, heavy scrape. A gust of air rose from below, cold, stale, and smelling of oil and time. Beneath them, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. Claire switched on her flashlight. The beam caught on dust particles, illuminating the narrow passage like a tunnel through fog. "You sure about this?" Eli asked, his voice low. "No," she said, her mouth dry. "But I'm going anyway." They descended slowly, each step creaking in the silence. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, until breathing felt like wading through history. The concrete walls were damp, veins of rust running through them like old wounds. "This isn't a basement," Eli whispered, touching the wall. "Look at the materials. Steel reinforcements, insulation. This is a vault." Claire's light flickered, the beam quivering across the narrow space. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the echo of their footsteps. At the bottom of the stairs stood another door, metal again. But this one different. No lock, no hinges, just a seamless surface carved by hand. She stepped closer, sweeping the light across it. The letters appeared one by one, etched deep into the steel. "What we owe." Claire's breath caught. The words looked fresh somehow, untouched by the years. Eli stood beside her, silent. "What we owe," she repeated, barely audible. The room was still. Even the air seemed to hesitate. For the first time since stepping into her uncle's world, Claire understood that she hadn't just inherited a building, she'd inherited a confession. And whatever debt Robert Jensen had carried, it was waiting right here in the dark, asking to be paid. The vault swallowed the sound of their breathing as soon as they stepped inside. The air was thick, old, carrying the scent of rust and earth and something faintly chemical. Claire's flashlight swept slowly across the darkness, cutting through layers of dust that rose like smoke. For a moment, she couldn't move. It wasn't fear exactly, more the weight of realization pressing down on her ribs. Her uncle hadn't built a hiding place. He'd built a sanctuary. Rows of wooden crates stood against the walls, stacked with military precision. Some were marked with faded shipping numbers, others unmarked entirely. A workbench sat near the far end, cluttered with papers, cracked glass jars, and rusted tools that hadn't been touched in decades. On the wall above it hung a single photograph, the edges curling with time, a group of men and women standing beside a mining truck. Their faces were weary, their smiles reluctant. Robert Jensen stood among them, younger, thinner, with eyes that already looked burdened by something too heavy to name. Eli approached the bench first, careful not to disturb anything. "He worked alone down here," he said quietly. "No one builds a place like this unless they're protecting something." Claire joined him, brushing dust off the papers. They weren't random. Each document was stamped with dates, coordinates, and codes. Some were letters written in tight, urgent handwriting. Others were photographs, villages, landscapes, and people. Children with bare feet standing in mud, their hands stained with the color of the earth that hid the stones. She felt her stomach twist. "What is this?" she murmured. Eli picked up one of the envelopes, his brow furrowing as he read. "These are shipping manifests, but not normal ones. He kept track of where the diamonds were taken from, not where they went." Claire frowned. Why would he do that? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the crates. The hinges groaned, and when the lid came loose, they both froze. Inside were burlap sacks filled with stones that glittered faintly in the beam of the flashlight. They weren't polished or cut, just raw, sharp, and ghostly pale. Diamonds, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. Eli sifted through one of the sacks, the stones clinking softly against each other. "These aren't stolen," he said. "They're reclaimed." "What do you mean?" He turned the flashlight toward one of the files on the table and tapped a paragraph written in her uncle's cramped handwriting. "Shipment intercepted. Smuggled goods seized. To be held until rightful ownership can be traced." "He wasn't part of the smuggling," Eli said, piecing it together aloud. "He was stopping it. He was documenting every illegal shipment coming through, hiding the stones before they reached the black market." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. She picked up a photograph from the table, a small boy sitting beside a woman, both covered in dust, both smiling faintly despite everything. On the back, in her uncle's hand, were the words, "For every life these stones cost, one must be returned clean." Her eyes burned. "He was trying to make it right," she said softly. Eli nodded, his jaw tight. "And now it's yours." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "You inherited the building. Everything in it comes with it, including this." Claire shook her head, taking a step back. "I can't, Eli. I'm a janitor, a single mom. I can't handle this." She gestured to the crates, the files, the ghosts of a life spent trying to undo wrongs too big for one man. He met her eyes steadily. "You already are. You found it. That counts for something." Before she could respond, a sound split the silence. A faint creak from above, sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. They both froze. The air changed again, charged and brittle. "Was that—" Claire began, but Eli held up a hand. Another creak followed, slower this time, deliberate. Someone was moving upstairs. He turned off his flashlight, plunging them into near darkness. Claire's heart pounded so loud she was sure whoever was above them could hear it. The only light came from the narrow crack between the hatch and the floor above, where faint dust motes drifted in and out of sight. Eli leaned close, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're not alone." Claire's mind raced. Had they been followed? Had the man from the SUV come back? She glanced toward the hatch, that thin barrier separating the living from the dead, the past from the present. The sound came again. Footsteps this time, crossing the boards directly above them, slow, purposeful, searching. She gripped the edge of the workbench to steady herself, the photograph still clutched in her other hand. In the faint light, the boy's smile seemed to waver, his eyes reflecting something that looked too much like fear. Eli leaned close enough that she could feel his breath. We need to get out," he murmured. Claire nodded, her throat too tight to speak. But as she turned toward the stairs, her eyes caught one last thing. A small brass box on the shelf behind the workbench, labeled in her uncle's handwriting, "Vault B Records. Do not open until it's safe." She didn't know why, but she grabbed it anyway. Then they climbed the stairs in silence, each creak of the wood above answering the drum of her heart below. The first sound wasn't footsteps at all, but the slow groan of wood, like the building exhaling under a weight it didn't want to hold. Then came the rhythm, measured, deliberate, too steady to be the settling of an old warehouse. Eli stiffened beside her. Claire felt his hand brush hers in the dark, a quiet signal to stay still. Her breath hitched in her chest as the beam of a flashlight sliced across the floor above, sweeping through the cracks between boards like a blade of light. They crouched lower behind the crates, hearts drumming in tandem with the creaks above. Dust floated in the air, stirred by the faint draft coming through the open hatch. Claire's palms were slick against the edge of the wooden box she clung to. The voice came next, smooth, low, unmistakable. "She's close," it said. Claire's blood went cold. The man from the SUV, the one in the gray suit, his tone was different now, less polite, more predatory. "We searched tonight," he added, his words rolling across the floorboards as if they had weight. Another voice answered, gruffer. She couldn't make out the words, but she caught the edge of it. Blueprint. Basement. Find it. Eli leaned close, his whisper barely a breath. "We can't go up." Claire swallowed, her throat dry. "What do we do?" she mouthed. He gestured to the crates stacked higher than their heads. "Stay down." "Wait." The footsteps grew louder, scattering dust from the beams above. Something heavy scraped against the floor. Maybe a chair? Maybe a box. She imagined them rifling through her uncle's papers, his secrets spread like open wounds across the desk. Her pulse hammered in her ears so loudly she thought they'd hear it. The flashlight beam darted again, sharper now, as if searching for cracks in their hiding place. It passed over the hatch opening, caught a glint of metal, then moved on. Claire didn't breathe, not once. She stared at Eli's profile in the dimness, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed upward like a soldier waiting for a bomb to drop. Minutes stretched, elastic and cruel, until they no longer felt like minutes at all. Time collapsed into the sound of boots shifting above, the low murmur of men exchanging clipped sentences, the soft hiss of pages being torn from a wall. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise started to thin. The footsteps receded, slower now, moving toward the far side of the warehouse. A door groaned open somewhere above, and a gust of cold night air swept down the hatch like a whisper. The last voice she heard before the silence returned was his again, the SUV man, calm and final. "She'll come back. We'll be ready." And then nothing. Eli's hand brushed hers again, this time to signal it was safe. He stood slowly, his knees cracking in the stillness, and extended a hand to help her up. Claire's legs were stiff, her heartbeat still echoing in her fingertips. Together they climbed the stairs, each step testing the silence like ice. When they emerged into the office, the air smelled faintly of cologne and rain. Papers lay scattered on the desk where she'd left them, neatly stacked. The ledger she'd been reading was open but untouched. But the blueprint, the single, fragile sheet that had guided them to the hatch, was gone. Claire's stomach dropped. "It's not here," she whispered. She darted to the other end of the room, scanning the walls, the floor, the piles of papers. Nothing. Eli picked up a torn scrap of tape from the corner of the bulletin board where the blueprint had been pinned. He crushed it between his fingers, his face darkening. They took it. Claire stared at him, panic rising like heat. "Then they know. They know about the vault now," he said grimly, cutting her off. His voice was low but certain, the kind of certainty that leaves no room for comfort. "And they won't stop." Claire looked toward the hatch, its metal edges still gleaming faintly in the dim light, the stairs descending into blackness below. For the first time since she'd inherited the warehouse, she felt truly exposed, like someone had reached into her chest and yanked out the fragile sense of control she'd been pretending to hold. She pressed a hand against the desk to steady herself. Eli moved to the window, peering out into the empty lot. "We'll need to move fast," he said. "Whatever your uncle hid down there, It's not just yours anymore." Claire didn't answer. She stared at the floor, at the faint footprints left in the dust by men who weren't supposed to know this place existed. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, waiting. And somewhere in the dark, she felt it. The promise of the vault, heavy as a heartbeat, calling her deeper, even as danger closed in from above. Claire drove home in silence, her fingers locked white around the steering wheel. The city rolled past in blurs of neon and rain, but she barely saw any of it. The night felt heavy, the kind that pressed against the windows and made the world smaller. By the time she reached her apartment building, her nerves were still humming from the sound of those men's voices in the warehouse. Every shadow felt too sharp, every echo too close. She climbed the stairs quickly, her keys clutched between her fingers like a weapon. That's when she saw it. A plain white envelope taped to her front door. No return address, no name, just 2 words written across the front in a shaky hand. "I'm sorry." Her stomach dropped. The hallway was empty. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a warning. She tore the envelope free and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. The apartment was still, her children asleep in their shared room, the sound of their soft breathing grounding her just enough to move. She switched on the lamp and slid the letter out. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her uncles. If you're reading this, it means they found you. Claire's pulse quickened. She sank into the chair by the window and read on. "They'll come for the diamonds. Don't sell. Don't trust anyone who says they can help. What's buried beneath this warehouse isn't just wealth, it's witness." Her hands trembled. Witness. The word felt alive, sharp. He hadn't been hiding treasure for himself. He'd been protecting evidence, proof. A smaller envelope was tucked behind the letter. She opened it carefully, and a photograph slipped out, old and worn, its corners softened by time. A young boy stood barefoot in the dirt, his face smudged, his eyes hollow. He was holding a rough stone the size of his fist. Behind him stretched a mining camp, shanties, machinery, men with rifles. The boy couldn't have been more than 8. Claire stared at it until her vision blurred. Her uncle's note burned in her hand, every sentence cutting deeper the more she read it. He hadn't been paranoid or delusional like the town had said. He had seen something he couldn't unsee. A key turned in the door behind her. She almost jumped before remembering she wasn't alone in this anymore. Eli stepped inside, his expression grave. He'd insisted on following her home after what had happened at the warehouse, saying, "You shouldn't be alone tonight." When he saw the letter in her hands, he closed the door quietly and crossed the room. "What's that?" She handed it to him wordlessly. He read fast, his eyes narrowing at the final lines. Then she passed him the photo. He stared at it for a long moment, jaw tightening. "That's why he did it," he said finally, voice rough. "He saw what it cost." Claire nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "He must have worked those mines," Eli continued softly. "Not as management, engineering, probably logistics, but he saw what was really happening. Kids digging with their hands, soldiers guarding bloodstones. He couldn't stop it there, so he tried to stop it here." Claire closed her eyes, the image of the boy etched into her mind. "He was trying to make it right," she whispered. "He stole the diamonds so they couldn't be sold. So no one could profit from them." "Yeah," Eli said, his voice heavy with understanding. "But he never finished. He must have known someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip." He looked back at the letter. "And now they're watching you." The words hit her like cold water. She stood and began pacing, her bare feet silent against the floor, the weight of it all pressed down, the men at the warehouse, the missing blueprint, the vault full of stolen stones that weren't stolen at all. The legacy she never asked for but couldn't walk away from. "Then we finish it," she said finally, turning toward him. Eli met her eyes, searching. "You sure you want to go that far? This isn't just dangerous. It's bigger than us." Claire took the photograph from his hand and held it up to the light. The boy's face glowed faintly under the lamp, small and defiant against the dark. "He didn't get to choose," she said quietly. Neither did my uncle, but I do, and I'm not running. Eli didn't argue, he just nodded once, the kind of nod that meant there was no going back. The rain started again outside, tapping softly against the window like a heartbeat. Claire placed the photo beside her uncle's letter on the table, the two ghosts of the past staring back at her, and felt something settle deep inside her, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She exhaled slowly. "He left me the witness," she said. "Now I'll make sure the world sees it." And somewhere, beneath the steady hum of the rain, the city seemed to pause, as if it too was listening. By the end of the week, Merrow Creek was buzzing like a hornet's nest. Every corner store, every cafe, every passing conversation carried her name like a stain. "Poor thing," someone muttered at the gas station. "Lost her husband, lost her job. Now she's chasing ghost treasure." At the diner, where the same crowd that used to smile at her now smirked into their coffee cups, a man said loud enough for everyone to hear, maybe she should start charging admission to her little mystery shack. Laughter followed, quick and cruel. Someone painted "Treasure Thief" in red across her garage door. Another night, a neighbor called the cops, claiming she'd been shouting in the driveway at no one. The officers arrived, hats dripping with rain, their eyes kind but wary. They asked if she was all right, if maybe she should take a break from the warehouse. She smiled politely, said she was fine, and watched them drive off without a clue. But the silence afterward was the hardest part, the quiet moments between the rumors and the fear, where even her reflection looked like someone she didn't recognize. The letter from her uncle sat on the kitchen counter, edges curling, next to the photograph of the boy. Every night she told herself to stop, to walk away before the storm swallowed her whole, and every morning she found herself standing at the warehouse door again. The real storm came without warning. Lightning split the horizon like a knife, thunder rolling in its wake. By the time she left the house, rain was already pouring in thick, relentless sheets. The road was a silver ribbon of water under her headlights. She could barely see the yellow lines as she drove toward the edge of town, her wipers struggling to keep up. She didn't know exactly what she was planning to do, only that she couldn't let the diamond stay buried any longer. When she pulled into the gravel lot, Eli's truck was already there, its windshield wipers frozen mid-swipe. The warehouse loomed ahead, glowing faintly under the strobes of lightning, as if the sky itself was illuminating what it wanted her to see. Eli stood near the entrance, soaked to the bone, his jacket clinging to his shoulders. "You picked a hell of a night," he said, shouting over the rain. She slammed the car door and met his gaze. "I couldn't sit home waiting for them to come again." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "We can't hide them forever," he said. "If we don't turn them in, someone else will find them." Lightning flashed, throwing the warehouse into stark relief. For a heartbeat, it looked like a cathedral, holy, wounded, and waiting. Claire stepped forward. "Then we find out who they were meant for." They worked in silence, side by side. The wind howled through the broken windows, rain leaking in thin streams down the concrete. Eli pried open the first crate while Claire sorted through the files, matching ledgers to photographs, coordinates to names. Each one told a story: families displaced, villages razed, workers killed for the stones now sitting quietly in their hands. "This isn't gold," Eli said, his voice rough with the weight of it. "This is blood." Claire met his eyes. "Then we clean it." They began packing the first crate, labeling it with new tags in her careful handwriting. She wrote slowly, deliberately, as if each letter could rewrite history. Shipment. Humanitarian repatriation. Origin, unlawful trade route. The sound of rain against the roof became deafening, each drop a drumbeat. Lightning flashed again, lighting up the photograph of the boy pinned on the wall. His eyes, dark and steady, seemed to watch them. Eli sealed the first box with tape, pressing his palm over it like a vow. "You think we can really fix this?" he asked. Claire paused, the pen still in her hand. "No," she said, "but maybe we can start." Outside, the storm raged like a living thing, tearing through the trees, slamming against the metal siding of the warehouse. Inside, the two of them worked in rhythm, their shadows moving against the flickering light. For the first time in months, Claire felt something other than fear, purpose. Every stone they touched, every record they packed, was one more piece of her uncle's burden lifted, one more step toward what he'd been trying to do all along. When they finished, the floor was littered with discarded tarps and wet footprints. The storm outside had no intention of ending, but inside something had shifted. Claire looked down at her hands, trembling from exhaustion, covered in dust and ink. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't gold after all, she murmured. Eli glanced up. No, he said quietly. It was justice. Thunder answered like applause, rolling through the valley and shaking the walls around them. And for the first time, Claire didn't flinch. The rain had quieted to a slow, rhythmic tapping by the time they returned to the vault. The storm had left the air heavy, the kind of stillness that feels borrowed rather than earned. Water dripped down through the cracks above, each drop hitting the concrete floor with the same careful cadence as a clock counting down. Claire stood at the edge of the stairs, flashlight trembling in her hand, while Eli wrestled with the lid of another crate. The wood creaked and splintered, the sound echoing down the narrow space. Inside, under layers of linen yellowed with age, something glimmered faintly. Claire leaned closer, her breath fogging in the cold air. Diamonds! Dozens of them, rough and uncut, each one catching the faint light and fracturing it into shards of quiet fire. But there was something else, too, stacks of envelopes bound together with brittle string. Eli brushed the dust away, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The handwriting on each was different, some neat and looping, others shaky, rushed. All of them addressed, names, cities, countries, South Africa, Belgium, Angola, Brazil. Claire took one at random and held it close to the light. Inside was a letter written in her uncle's hand, his words precise, almost reverent. To the family of Emmanuel Kunda, it began. This diamond was taken without consent. It belongs to you, as does the acknowledgement of what was done in your name. Her throat tightened. She set it down and reached for another. To the descendants of Elodie Kasima, to the son of Jonah Lunda. Each letter carried the same message, each one an apology written decades too late, but still determined to be sent. Eli's voice came low and rough behind her. He tracked the mines, he said. These are restitution records, every stone linked to a name. Claire blinked hard, her eyes burning. He wasn't hoarding them, she said, her voice cracking. He was saving them. For who? For the families, she whispered, for the people they were stolen from. She looked around the vault, at the files, the photos, the quiet testimony her uncle had buried beneath his own life. It wasn't greed that had kept him silent. It was fear that if he turned the truth over to the wrong hands, it would disappear all over again. He died trying to finish this, she said, almost to herself. Eli rested his hand on the edge of the crate. Then we'll finish it for him. Her eyes met his. And for the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation, just understanding. They would find the families. They would return every diamond, every letter, every piece of her uncle's unfinished atonement. Claire lifted another envelope, brushing away the dust. The weight of it felt sacred. She imagined the journey it had waited to take, the distance between a life stolen and a truth finally delivered. She thought of her uncle sitting here in the dark, writing these letters by hand, one by one, his pen scratching out redemption long after the world stopped listening. "Do you think he knew," she asked quietly, "that someone would come looking for this?" Eli gave a faint nod. He knew they'd never let it stay buried. Claire tucked the letter back into the crate and reached for another stack, unaware of the faint sound above them, the soft grind of footsteps on wet gravel. Someone else was in the building. Eli's head lifted slightly, listening, but the sound vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the hum of dripping water and their own quiet breaths. Claire didn't notice. She was lost in the papers, tracing the names with trembling fingers, the enormity of her uncle's secret blooming inside her chest. "He wanted the world to see what it cost," she murmured. "Every carat, every coin, every life." Eli looked down at the glittering stones, his reflection fractured in the facets. "Then let's make sure it does." A faint draft whispered through the stairwell, stirring the dust. The hatch above them had shifted slightly. Neither of them saw the faint beam of light creeping across the floor or the shadow that lingered just beyond the threshold. Claire held up the final envelope, her thumb brushing across her uncle's handwriting, and for a moment she felt almost at peace. She didn't see the danger waiting above, or the figure watching through the crack in the door, only the promise in her uncle's words. She didn't know yet that someone else had followed her there, and that the past she was trying to make right was about to come looking for her in return. The smell of smoke reached them before the sound did. It was faint at first, just a hint of burning wood carried through the early dawn, but enough to make Eli look up sharply from the papers spread across the workbench. Claire followed his gaze toward the small window near the ceiling, where a thin gray ribbon curled upward into the light. She didn't speak. Neither of them did. They just ran. By the time they reached the top of the stairs, the smoke was thicker, seeping through the cracks in the warehouse walls like a warning too late to heed. Outside, through the rain-streaked glass, she saw it. The black SUV parked at an angle, its headlights off, but its presence loud in the silence. And beside it, silhouettes moving through the fog. Men, 3, maybe 4, each holding something that flickered orange in the wind. Torches. "They're burning it," Claire said, her voice strangled, already breaking into panic. Eli grabbed her arm. "Claire!" But she was already moving. She threw open the door, the cold air slamming against her face as she bolted toward the smoke. "No! No, please!" The men didn't even look at her. One turned, his face half lit by the fire, but his expression was blank, mechanical. Behind him, the flames roared higher, licking across the walls of the warehouse, devouring the wood and the memories with the same hunger. Eli caught up to her just as she reached the door. "We can't fight them," he shouted over the crackling chaos. But Claire was already pulling free. "I have to." He tried again to hold her back, but she shoved him off with a strength that startled them both. She grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher from the wall, yanked the pin, and disappeared into the smoke. Inside, the air was an ocean of heat and color. The fire had already spread across the rafters, raining embers like angry stars. Every step was agony, the soles of her shoes sticking to the melting floor, her lungs clawing for breath. The sound was monstrous, a living roar that drowned out everything else. "Robert," she whispered hoarsely, as if her uncle could still hear her, "I'm sorry." She stumbled through the haze, using the beam of her flashlight like a lifeline, until she saw it. A crate near the back corner, still untouched, half shielded by fallen debris. She coughed, eyes burning, and kicked the lid until the nails gave way. The wood splintered, and from within came a glittering rush of light, diamonds spilling across the ground, scattering like spilled constellations. Claire froze for a heartbeat, the sight surreal against the chaos. Then instinct took over. She knelt, scooping handfuls of the stones into her jacket pockets, her sleeves, anywhere she could hold them. The smoke clawed at her throat. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to the sound of crackling wood and the relentless hammer of her heartbeat. "Claire!" Eli's voice cut through the roar like a distant echo. She turned, disoriented, the extinguisher slipping from her hand. A shape moved through the flames toward her. Eli, his face streaked with ash, his shirt pulled over his mouth. He grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now." She tried to protest, but her words came out as a cough. Together they stumbled through the collapsing haze, every step a fight against the fire's pull. A beam fell behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. Eli shielded her as they pushed through the door, the blast of cold air outside hitting them like a wave. They collapsed onto the gravel, gasping. the rain hissing as it met the flames. Claire rolled onto her side, coughing until her throat felt raw. The warehouse was no longer a building. It was a bonfire. Every secret her uncle had hidden, now burning into the night sky. Eli pulled himself to his feet, staring at the inferno. "It's gone," he said, voice low, defeated. Claire didn't answer. She sat up slowly, the weight of something pressing against her ribs. She opened her jacket. Diamonds, raw, uncut, shining faintly in the firelight. Not many, but enough. Enough to prove he hadn't been mad. Enough to finish what he started. Her hand shook as she cupped them, the stones glinting through her tears. The warehouse that had broken her life was now nothing but ash, but somehow its secret had survived. Eli knelt beside her, his face lit by the dying flames. "You saved them." Claire shook her head, still trembling. "No," she whispered. "He did." And as the last of the roof caved in, sending sparks spiraling into the dark, Claire realized that even fire couldn't erase truth. It only revealed what was too pure to burn. The knock on Claire's door was polite, measured. 3 soft raps like someone who knew how to knock without making an entrance. She opened it to find a woman in a raincoat, hair pinned back in a tight knot, eyes that didn't miss anything. Mara Ruiz carried herself with the kind of confidence that made you trust her before you knew why. There was a press badge clipped to her bag and a notebook tucked under her arm, the corners worn from use. "Miss Jensen?" she asked. "Mara Ruiz. I write for the Tribune." Claire looked past her at the sitting room, at the photograph of the boy from the mining camp taped to the full, the uncle's letter still splayed on the table. The past few days had taught her to be careful with strangers. "You're the reporter everyone talks about," she said instead of hello. "You're the one who follows the stories nobody wants to admit exist." Mara offered a small, rueful smile. "Guilty." She stepped inside without asking, setting her bag on the coffee table as if it belonged there. Her voice was warm but urgent. "I've been tracking rumors about conflict diamonds for years. There's chatter about shipments that vanished off manifests, evidence that keeps getting buried. When I heard some woman in town inherited a warehouse and people were making jokes, well, something told me to check." Claire's first reaction was anger, at the idea that her grief and confusion had become someone else's lead. But the anger settled quickly under something else, a deep, exhausted need for the truth to be witnessed. She nodded toward the envelope on the table. "You know about the photograph." Mara's fingers hovered, respectful, before she reached for the picture and turned it over with careful hands. Her face changed as she read the handwriting. A beat. Then she pulled something from her leather notebook, a yellowed newspaper clipping, its edges brittle. The headline was old, the typeface of another era, but the photograph was unmistakable. Robert Jensen, younger, with dirt on his hands and a small boy at his side. The setting was the same as the photograph Claire had. Mud, crude shelters, a truck in the background. "You found this?" Mara asked, incredulous and almost reverent. "This ties him directly to the camps. Whoever your uncle worked with, this was no casual contractor. He knew those places. He knew the cost." Claire's mouth went dry. "He kept records," she said. "Ledgers, letters, names. I thought he was hoarding junk. Turns out he was keeping witness." Mara set the clipping down slowly. "If this is real, if you have the ledgers, the stones, the letters, this could blow open a laundering network. Companies, shell shipments, falsified manifests. Wordstone's people have been sniffing around you." "That's not about architecture." Her eyes darkened. "They're afraid." Claire flinched at the name. Wordstone, the suit, the SUV. Memory tightened in her chest like a fist. "They tried to burn it," she said. "They tried to scare me off. They took the blueprint. Someone wrote, 'Leave it alone,' on my desk." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then this isn't a story to bury, Claire. It's a story that needs armor. If Wordstone is involved, they'll fight back with legal teams, PR, money. We go public wrong, and they'll drown the truth in noise." Claire watched the journalist for a long moment, measuring the woman's steady gaze against the tremor in her own hands. The ledgers sat upstairs. In a safety box, the diamonds, those she'd saved, were wrapped in cloth and tucked away in her closet, still glittering in the dark when she woke at night. She'd inherited fear as much as a building. She'd also inherited a choice. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. Mara folded her hands, earnest now. "Access to the ledgers, names, dates, everything. And your voice. We'll build a narrative that's airtight, documents, photographic evidence, witnesses if we can find them. If we do this carefully, they can't bury it. If we do it fast and sloppy, they will." Claire thought of the boy's face, of her uncle writing apology letters to people he'd never meet again. She thought of Eli's steady shoulders and the way the town had turned laughter into weaponry. She pictured the crates, the tarps, the brittle envelopes bound in string. "All right," she said, "but on my terms." Mara's expression softened, then sharpened with agreement. "Name them." Claire inhaled and named the first condition. No leaks, no premature press releases, no grandstanding interviews until the facts were airtight. She named another. Community representatives from the affected regions would have a say in how the stones were handled. And one more. No corporate-friendly lawyers, no backroom deals. Mara listened, nodding, cataloging each demand like it mattered. When Claire finished, Mara folded her notebook closed and met her eyes. "Then let's make sure they can't bury this again," she said, voice low but fierce. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, rain beginning to whisper like stationary applause. Inside, two unlikely allies sat with an old photograph between them and a plan forming like a small, dangerous promise. The story broke at midnight, the headline stamped across every glowing screen like a verdict. "Single mother inherits warehouse, finds evidence of $22 million in conflict diamonds." Within hours, the quiet town of Marrow Creek became a swarm of flashing lights and satellite dishes. News vans crowded the narrow streets. Reporters in perfect suits stood in the rain, rehearsing lines about the mystery woman turned whistleblower. The same people who had laughed at her in the diner were now waving at her front door with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Claire didn't open the door for any of them. She watched from her window as microphones and cameras turned her street into a stage. Someone even hung a banner that read, "Local Hero," like this was a parade instead of a reckoning. Neighbors who once avoided her now left casseroles and flowers on her porch. A few even said they always knew she was destined for something bigger. Claire almost laughed at that, the kind of hollow laugh that burns more than it soothes. None of it mattered, the noise, the applause, the attention. It was all background hum. What mattered were the envelopes. The first batch of restitution stones had already been delivered, each diamond accompanied by a letter handwritten by her uncle and sealed decades ago. They went not to collectors or investors, but to families, to communities that had been gutted and forgotten. Each package carried a name, a story, a wound that might never heal but could at least be acknowledged. She watched the first delivery broadcast live. A small village in Angola. A woman standing in front of her rebuilt home holding a single uncut diamond in her palm as if it were a prayer. "It's not the stone," the translator said. "It's the proof that someone remembered us." Claire's throat tightened, her heart hammering. For the first time, the weight of the diamonds didn't feel like burden. It felt like justice finally breathing. By noon, reporters were outside the warehouse, shouting questions through the wind. "Miss Jensen, did you know about your uncle's crimes? Who's funding your restitution project? Are you afraid for your safety?" Eli stood near the entrance, arms folded, his shirt sleeves rolled, and his expression set somewhere between defiance and exhaustion. He was no longer just the man with the toolbox. Now, he was the anchor she didn't know she needed. Mara Ruiz stood on the makeshift podium, cameras pointed squarely at her. She had fought for this moment, for the right to tell the story correctly, truthfully. When she nodded to Claire, the crowd went silent. Claire stepped forward, her hair pulled back, her eyes steady. The lights were blinding, but she didn't flinch. "My uncle didn't steal these diamonds," she began, her voice calm and unwavering. "He rescued them. He took them out of hands that used people like machines and gave them back to the people who paid the price in blood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. She continued, her voice rising with quiet conviction. "These stones don't represent wealth. They represent loss. And we will not let them be sold again. Not by corporations, not by governments, not by anyone who sees profit where there should be remembrance." Eli stood just off to the side, his gaze fixed on her. Mara caught his eye, a small smile flickering at the corner of her mouth, pride and relief that Claire had claimed her place in the story. The conference lasted 20 minutes, but the tremors of it spread across the world. Within hours, international networks picked it up. Economists debated the fallout. Activists called her brave. Others called her reckless. Wardstone's stock plummeted overnight. Somewhere behind the noise, behind the breaking headlines and the televised gratitude, Claire could feel the shift, power, cracking under the weight of exposure. But power doesn't forgive exposure. That evening, long after the cameras left and the applause faded into night, Claire sat alone in the warehouse's ruins. Rain slipped through the holes in the ceiling, tapping against the floor where ashes still clung to the edges of her shoes. She turned one of the remaining diamonds over in her hand, the reflection of the flickering lamplight dancing across its facets. Outside, a car idled at the end of the street. Black SUV. No license plate she could see. The hum of its engine was low, patient, watching. Claire's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. She closed her fist around the stone, her breath slow and even. Let them watch. The truth was out now, and no amount of fire or fear could burn it back into silence. The courthouse smelled like old wood and rain. Cameras flashed outside as Claire walked up the marble steps, a trench coat drawn tight around her shoulders, the sound of shouting reporters echoing down the columns. "Ms. Jensen, how do you feel about Wardstone's lawsuit? Do you regret going public? Did your uncle really steal those diamonds?" The questions tangled together like thorns. She didn't answer any of them. She just kept walking, her heels clicking in steady rhythm against the stone. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, but the tension buzzed all the same. Wardstone Group had come prepared for war. Their lawyers sat lined in perfect formation, sharp suits, sharper smiles. At the center table, their lead counsel, a man with silver hair and a voice that could make lies sound like lullabies, stacked files neatly beside his water glass. When he looked up at her, his eyes were devoid of warmth. "Ms. Jensen," he said, voice low enough for only her to hear, "you've made quite a mess." Claire met his gaze evenly. "No," she said softly, "you did." Mara sat in the gallery, scribbling notes in the margins of her notepad, her press badge tucked into her jacket. Eli was there too, on the witness list but waiting quietly in the back row, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The trial stretched for days. Wardstone accused Claire of theft, defamation, property damage, and malicious intent to destabilize a reputable corporation. The phrases sounded rehearsed, practiced, scrubbed of all humanity. They painted her as a reckless woman chasing attention, someone who stumbled into a fairy tale and tried to make herself its hero. But truth, when it finally finds its way to air, doesn't need polish. It breathes on its own. Mara had found the evidence first, documents smuggled out by an anonymous source, stamped with Wardstone's corporate seal, shipping manifests connecting the company to unregistered transport routes across Africa. Each file traced back to the same coded accounts, the same missing stones, the same unmarked crates. When the Tribune published excerpts during the trial, the courtroom shifted like the ground had cracked open beneath it. The lead attorney's voice lost its charm. The executives avoided her eyes. And then came Eli. He took the stand wearing his best shirt, sleeves rolled down, the weight of years of work still clinging to his posture. "I saw them," he said, voice low but steady. "Two men from Wardstone. They broke into the warehouse the night of the fire. They took the blueprint. I watched them carry accelerants inside." The prosecutor asked, "You're sure they were Wardstone's employees?" Eli nodded. "I recognized one of them from the SUV that came by weeks before. Same man who offered to buy the warehouse. Same man who told Claire to leave it alone." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of papers, and one loud objection that the judge immediately overruled. Claire sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her pulse a quiet roar in her ears. The days that followed blurred together, more witnesses, more documents. Wardstone's lawyers fought like cornered animals, objections, counterclaims, procedural tricks, but the truth was already spreading faster than they could contain it. The public turned. The same networks that had once mocked her now replayed clips of the testimony on repeat. The words corporate corruption and humanitarian restitution crawled across every news ticker. On the final day, when the verdict was read, the courtroom felt heavy with something sacred. The judge's voice was calm but sure. Wardstone executives indicted on 6 counts of trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Claire's hands trembled in her lap. Eli's hand brushed her shoulder from behind, grounding her in the moment. Mara caught her eye from across the room, her expression unreadable, a mixture of triumph and tenderness. For a long moment, no one moved. The gavel struck once. The sound was small, almost anticlimactic. Justice didn't feel like she thought it would. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clean. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like release, like something uncoiled inside her after too many years of being wound tight. After the hearing, the prosecutor found her in the hallway. He was younger than she expected, his tie loosened, his face drawn with exhaustion, but kind. "You're free, Ms. Jensen," he said. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been that way all along," she said. "I just forgot." Outside, the world had shifted again. The cameras were still there, the shouts still echoing, but the noise didn't reach her anymore. Claire stepped into the sunlight, eyes half closed against its brightness, and felt for the first time, not like the woman who inherited a building of ghosts, but the one who finally opened the door and let them rest. The lot where the warehouse once stood was quiet again, but not in the way it used to be. The air no longer smelled like smoke and ruin. It smelled like wet soil and new beginnings. The last of the debris had been cleared, the ashes collected and mixed into the cement that would soon hold something better, something alive. Claire stood near the edge of the construction site, a hard hat perched loosely on her head, the early morning sun catching the edges of her hair. Where the old walls once rose in shadow, a single banner now fluttered in the breeze. The Jensen Hope Foundation. It had taken months of paperwork, meetings, and more sleepless nights than she could count. But it was real now, funded by the restitution money reclaimed from Wardstone's frozen accounts. The money wasn't for her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. It was for the children whose names had been written in her uncle's letters, the ones who had lived entire lives defined by someone else's greed. The foundation would build schools in mining regions, fund literacy programs, and train teachers. It wasn't enough to fix what had been broken, but it was a start. Eli stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, a faint trace of sawdust on his jeans. He looked at the banner, then at the half-laid cornerstone gleaming pale in the sunlight. "Your uncle built walls," he said softly. "You built windows." Claire smiled, her throat tightening at the simplicity of it. "Maybe both were needed," she said. "He kept it hidden, so I could bring it into the light." The mayor gave a short speech, something about resilience and redemption, but the words drifted past her. Cameras flashed, reporters jotted notes, and people clapped politely. But Claire barely heard the applause. Her children, Ethan and Lily stood beside her, small hands clutching hers. They didn't understand the politics or the headlines, but they understood that this place, the ashes beneath their feet, was where their mother had stopped surviving and started building. When the mayor shook her hand, she smiled for the cameras, but her eyes were somewhere else. She wasn't thinking about the attention or the praise. She was thinking about the letter she'd received 2 days ago, handwritten, postmarked from Kinshasa. Inside was a photograph. 2 boys standing in front of a small rebuilt school, holding a sign that read, "Merci pour nos noms retrouvés." Thank you for giving us our names back. They were brothers, once separated after a mining collapse 20 years ago. The notes her uncle had written had led investigators to their family. Now they were together again. She'd cried quietly when she saw it, not from grief, but from relief. For the first time, she believed that redemption could ripple forward instead of backward. The ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed, and dusk fell slowly over the lot. Workers packed up their tools, laughter trailing into the distance. Eli lingered, leaning against his truck, watching as Claire knelt near the foundation stone. The moon had risen full and bright, washing the site in silver. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was one uncut diamond, rough and imperfect, the last of what she'd kept from the vault. She turned it over in her palm, its edges catching the light. "He carried too much alone," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the hum of crickets. "He can rest now." She placed the stone carefully onto the cornerstone, pressing it into the wet concrete. For a moment the light caught on it and flared, just a glimmer, a breath of color in the gray. Then it settled, part of the structure, part of the promise. Eli approached, his boots soft against the dirt. "You think he'd be proud?" Claire looked up at the stars, her hands covered in dust. "I think he'd be at peace," she said. They stood there in silence, the night stretching out around them, the foundation cooling beneath their feet. Somewhere far away in a village that once knew only silence, a bell would ring the next morning, the first school day of a new beginning. And under the moonlight, Claire Jensen finally let the past rest, not buried this time, but built into something that could stand. The foundation had grown into something alive. The once empty lot now shimmered in the late afternoon sun, its glass windows reflecting gold and soft pink hues as the day bowed toward evening. Where ashes and ruin had once settled, laughter now drifted from open doors. Children ran through the courtyard, their voices bright against the hum of life inside. Claire stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, breathing in the sound of everything that had been rebuilt from silence. The Jensen Hope Foundation wasn't just a building anymore. It had become a heartbeat, a place where lessons were taught in 3 languages, where families gathered after long days, where the air smelled of chalk, rain, and beginnings. There was a mural now on the east wall, painted by local students. It showed hands, hundreds of them, reaching toward a rising sun. Beneath it, the inscription read, "What we owe each other." Claire walked slowly up the path, the soles of her shoes pressing softly into the gravel. In her hands she carried a small tin box, wrapped carefully in a linen handkerchief. It was light, but the weight of what it held made her heart thrum with quiet reverence. Inside were the last of the recovered stones, tiny, rough diamonds, untouched and imperfect. Not for sale, not for display, just for remembrance. The plaque was already waiting for her, newly mounted beside the entrance. Polished bronze with engraved words, simple enough to speak volumes, "What we owe." She knelt in front of it, the gravel cool under her knees, and brushed away a few stray leaves that had gathered in the corner. "I think you'd like this," she murmured. Her voice trembled, but the ache behind it was softer now, like an old scar she'd learned to live around. "It's not a secret anymore." She opened the tin and looked at the stones one last time. They glimmered faintly in the sunlight, each one catching light in its own way, like small unspoken truths that refused to stay buried. She poured them gently into the hollow beneath the plaque, letting them rest against the earth, and whispered, "He can rest now." A soft breeze stirred her hair, brushing it across her face. For a moment, she thought she heard the faintest echo of her uncle's voice, or maybe just her own thoughts speaking back. Either way, she smiled. "Mom?" The voice was small, but clear. She turned to see Emma standing behind her, a backpack slung over one shoulder, her sneakers scuffed from running around the courtyard. She was taller now, her face losing the roundness of childhood, her eyes bright and curious. Claire rose and brushed off her hands. "Hey, sweetheart." Emma looked at the building, then at the plaque, her brows furrowing. "Are we rich now?" she asked with complete innocence. Claire felt the question settle in her chest, the kind that children ask without realizing how deeply it lands. She smiled, kneeling so their eyes met. "In all the ways that matter," she said. Emma thought about that, then nodded seriously, satisfied with the answer. She reached for her mother's hand. "Can we go home now?" "I'm hungry." Claire laughed softly, the sound gentle and free. "Yeah," she said. "Let's go home." They walked back toward the car together, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The sun was dipping low now, setting the building aglow from within. Claire turned once more before opening the car door, letting her gaze linger on the golden light spilling through the windows. In the center of the facade, just above the entryway, the memorial diamond embedded in the wall caught the final rays of the setting sun. It flashed once, a spark, quick and playful, like a wink from someone long gone, but never forgotten. Claire felt her throat tighten, but not from grief, from gratitude. The sound of her daughter's humming filled the air as she started the engine. The road ahead stretched quiet and familiar, lined with the same trees that had watched her lose everything and build it back again. Behind her, the foundation glowed against the twilight, a beacon born from ruin. The laughter of the town that once mocked her had faded into something softer, something that sounded almost like music. And as the last light touched the diamond one final time, it shimmered, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what had finally been made whole. If this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to share it. Tell us. Where in the world are you reading from, and what part of Claire's journey spoke to your heart the most? Your words inspire more stories like this one. And if you believe in hope, redemption, and the quiet power of doing what's right, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story that just might change the way you see the world.